Let's please welcome Mr. Steve Roberts and Mr. David Rubenstein.
Well, welcome. Delighted to have you all at this session. And yes, Stephanie's correct. We are friends. And therefore, my first question to David is something he told me in an earlier conversation about the MOM test. Explain to them the importance of the MOM test in philanthropy.
Well, when I was building my firm, Carlyle, it was a nice private equity firm, became one of the larger ones in the world. And as it was being built, my mother, I talked to her regularly, but she didn't say, well, I'm proud of you for building this firm, or you did a great job, or how much money did you make today, or that's a great deal you did. But when I started giving away a fair amount of money, she would call me and say, well, you're actually doing something useful with your money. I'm proud of you, finally. And so, I took the mother test. Is if your mother calls you up, especially if you have a Jewish mother, and she says something nice, that's probably meaning you're probably doing something useful with your life.
Of course, when I called my Jewish mother and told her I was marrying a Catholic, that didn't go over so well. But although it did work out, Koki and I are about to have our 50th wedding anniversary.
Good for you. Wow.
But David, as you point out, you weren't born to wealth or a tradition of philanthropy. Very much a self-made man, having helped create this enormously successful investment business. Talk about how you made the transition that made your mother so proud, the transition from making money to giving money. How did that work in your own mind, and what were some of the incentives and turning points?
Well, you're right. I grew up in a very modest blue-collar family in Baltimore. My parents were not college graduates, nor were they high school graduates. I was their only child, and so, having enough money to get by on was generally their focus. So I didn't really think about giving away large sums of money when I was growing up. When I got lucky in the business world, and it turned out that I had made more money than I really could spend in a sensible way, or than I thought was sensible to give to my children, leaving aside whether that was their view or not. I was kind of outed by Forbes magazine. They had an article pointing out what my net worth was, and it seemed awfully high to any normal human being, except perhaps Bill Gates or somebody. And I realized that I had these options, as most people do who get fortunate in life in terms of finances. One, you can take your money and be buried with it the way the ancient pharaohs were. There's no evidence you actually need the money in the afterlife, so it didn't seem to me that holding on to it until my death and then putting it in the grave with me was a good idea. So then you have the other options of you can do what many people do, and historically most people have done, just give it to their children upon their death, or some point before their death, but then mostly upon their death. And I didn't think that that was a great idea, because my observation is that virtually nobody who's inherited staggering sums of money has gone on to win a Nobel Prize or do something that was, changing the world for the better. Obviously, very wealthy people have done great things, but generally, if you inherit $1 billion, you're probably not going to be as motivated to do something as if you have to make it yourself. So I thought it might not be a good thing to me to give my children this much money upon my death. Secondly, I felt that if I could give it to them during their lifetime, I might see their being spoiled while I was alive, and that probably wasn't a good thing either. And so you have the choice of giving it away and or spending it. And how many homes, how many planes, how many boats does one really need? You can only live in so many of these places. So I thought, once you've taken care of your basic shelter needs or so forth, I would basically give away the money. And then I decided to give it away while I was alive, because I wasn't sure I would be in a place when I died where I would see from afar how it was being spent by some philanthropic organization. So I decided I would basically try to give it away while I was alive. And that also gave me some insurance that none of those philanthropic organizations would give me high cholesterol food while I was, on their list of potential people who might make a gift upon my death. They would speed it up. They thought maybe by giving me high cholesterol food. So I thought if I tell them I'm giving away while I'm alive, they would treat me well while I was in the process of giving away.
You reverse the incentives.
Right.
in favor of longevity as
Right.
opposed, yes.
And I have a theory as well that when you're giving away money, God looks favorably upon you because look at John D. Rockefeller lived in 97, David Rockefeller 101. So, you know, I have a theory that God looks upon people favorably who give away money, and therefore you have a longer lifespan. And then maybe also, as I tell people who I'm trying to get money from for philanthropic organizations, not only will you live long, but you have a special place in heaven reserved for you if you give away money. So, and people look at me quizzically, but I say, well, you know, I can't prove it, but why would you want to see if I'm wrong or not? So don't take a chance. And so, you know, I decided to ultimately to get involved with organizations that I thought I could either do one of three things. I mean, there's an infinite amount of money, infinite amount of great causes in the world, and you know, I'm sure I could give away all my net worth this morning to people here, and I'm sure every one of you has a great cause, right? Okay, right. And I could hitchhike.
That was the most popular thing you said already.
I could hitchhike back to my office and having no money left, but I think there's, look, I say this very seriously. Suppose all of you had the problem, and you'll laugh about it, that Bill Gates has. He basically got very fortunate, very gifted person, he's very smart, but for a lot of things it went in his way, and he has more or less $100 billion. So let's suppose each of you, imagine you had $100 billion. What would you do with it? Okay, you're going to laugh about it, you'll have fun. Okay, so you go buy a couple homes, planes, boats, jewelry, whatever you might want. Then you got 99.5 billion left. What are you going to do? Okay, so, you know, it's a serious problem because you've got this money and there's responsibility. What are you going to do with it? Well, he decided that K-12 education in the United States and health in Africa were two of the most important things in the world. His wife, Melinda, has another view, and she's helping in you know, women's health, among other issues. But it's a serious problem. What do you do with this much money? And, you know, I don't have that much money, but I'm trying to find things in my case where I can start something that wouldn't otherwise get started. I can finish something that wouldn't otherwise get finished, and where I have an intellectual interest in it and a connection to a family connection or some other connection such that I'm likely to stay involved. There's many different ways you can do philanthropy. You can just write the checks and just say to somebody else, go ahead and do what you want with it, and hopefully I'll get a report annually about it. And that's nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of great philanthropists who give away billions of dollars a year, and they're just not engaged that much in where the money goes. They read about it, but they're not really going to visit the places. They don't want to meet the people that are the recipients. There's another way of doing it, which is to try to get involved and be connected. And I'd like to be somewhat involved, and that's why I'm on a lot of these nonprofit boards, and I chair a lot of fundraising campaigns. You know, Einstein said that the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. My view is the definition of insanity is chairing 6 capital campaigns at the same time. And so I'm doing that now. I'm chairing 6 capital campaigns, and you know, I don't mind asking other people for money because I'm giving money myself to these same sources, and if I think it's good enough for me, I think it should be good enough for other people. And I really don't like it when people come to me and say, well, I'm sorry to ask you for money. Well, if you're sorry, don't ask me. So, and I don't say to people, I'm sorry to ask you for money. If I think it's a good cause, I will ask them. And generally, I think I'm doing people a favor because if it's a good cause and I think it's useful, I think they will benefit from it. Obviously, everybody has their own perspectives on what's important or not, but I have picked things where I am intellectually engaged with it. I want to stay involved with it. I want to observe how the improvement occurs because of what I've done. And then also, I want to do something which wouldn't happen if I didn't do it or wouldn't be completed if I didn't get involved.
Well, you mentioned that Bill Gates has developed an interest in global health and in primary education. Give us an example of a couple of the areas where, as you realized you had this enormous fortune and that you wanted to give it away in your lifetime, how you started making choices and what were some of the lessons people would learn from both the good choices you made and the mistakes you made.
Well, I don't have all the time to talk about my mistakes, but I, like most people who get fortunate, have more money than they really need for their day-to-day living. I you know, could have hired a lot of consultants and said, what should I do with my money? And like a lot of people, I would get recommendations that give it to universities, and I'm a gigantic believer in universities. I'm on a lot of university boards and very involved with them. I think higher education in the United States is one of our great assets and one of our great treasures in the United States, our higher education system. And you could do a lot in medical research, and obviously everybody wants to live longer and be healthier, so who could be against better medical research? And I give a fair amount of my money to that. In fact, the bulk of my money probably goes to education and medical research. However, there's one thing that came along that doesn't consume the largest amount of my money, but it gets the most amount of attention. And I've coined a phrase for it, and it's called patriotic philanthropy. And let me describe what I mean. Like most people who come from modest circumstances, I'm very privileged to be where I am now, and I'm very proud to be an American. And I wanted to kind of remind people about the good things about our country and also some of the bad things. And so I, by happenstance, fell into doing something. And I think if I'd hired McKinsey and said, or BCG or Bain, give me an idea of how I can give back to the country, they would have given me a report and maybe 1,000 pages of what I could do, and it probably wouldn't have been as creative and as interesting as what turned out to be the case by serendipity. And here's what happened. I happened to go to a viewing of a document called the Magna Carta in Sotheby's, and I said, what's the Magna Carta doing here? It must be in London. But it turns out that there are actually 17 copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, one in the Australian Parliament, and one was owned by Ross Perot. He decided to put it up for sale, and Sotheby's was going to sell it the next night. And they told me that it would likely leave the United States. Well, I knew enough about American history to know that while it was drafted in England in the 1200s, it was a document that dramatically influenced the founding fathers in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and Declaration of Independence in terms of the rights we had as Englishmen at the time. And so I decided it would be good if one of the 17 copies could stay in the United States. So I just resolved the next night I would go back and buy it. Now, I didn't want to tell my wife, it sounds presumptuous, say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. And I didn't want to tell my children. They'd say, well, how much less money might this mean for us? So I didn't tell anybody. So I just went the next night.
You didn't even tell your wife that Sotheby's is next to Cartier's.
I didn't say any of that. I just went the next night, and they put me in a little room, and they closed the door, and I didn't know Sotheby's that well. I'd never been there. I'm not an art collector, really. So all of a sudden, if you've ever been in an auction, you get in the swing of things, and they started bidding, and I said, okay, I started bidding, and next thing I know, boom, they said sold. So I couldn't hear that well, and I didn't know what happened. The head of Sotheby's came in and said, guess what, you just bought the Magna Carta. I said, okay. He said, who are you? We've never seen you before. And I told my wife, he says, oh, by the way, do you have the money for this? And I said, yes. So he said, okay, you can slip out a side door, and nobody will ever know. We'll keep it a secret. Or there's 100 reporters there who want to know who bought the Magna Carta. And I said, oh, I'm happy to tell them why I did it and who I am. So I went out and said, look, I came from very modest circumstances. I want to begin to repay my debt to the United States for the good fortune I've had. So I'm going to make this a permanent loan to the United States, and upon my death, it'll be there forever. And so it's now at the National Archives. And that, so of course, after that happened, I went to the dinner at the head of Citicorp's house that night, and I said, I'm sorry I'm an hour late. I'm sorry for dinner about being late. I said, I just had to buy
the Magna Carta weighs a lot, and I've been carrying it around.
Well, I said, I had bought the Magna Carta. I was late. He said, oh, sure. So the next day, it was on the front page of the New York Times. He called me, and he said, I didn't really believe you. Nobody ever come to my house before and bought the Magna Carta. So anyway, but then I started getting emails from everybody saying, well, if you want a Magna Carta, I have one, and you could have called me. So now I've told people I don't want to corner the market on Magna Cartas, but they're all fake, the other ones. So anyway, and then I got in the habit of saying, well, look, people offer me rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, rare copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, rare copies of the 13th Amendment, rare copies of the Bill of Rights, rare copies of the Constitution that are historic. And I thought if I put them in places where Americans can see them, A, they might learn a little bit more about American history because people know so little about our country's history, unfortunately. And B, it would be a good way to preserve these for our future generations. So I've begun to buy these, and I put these in other places around the country and organizations in the United States, like the State Department or in the Smithsonian or the National Archives or Library of Congress or things like that. And so that's one thing that happened. Then another thing that happened, it was serendipity, was I was out of town, and one day there was an earthquake in Washington, and it turns out that the Washington Monument had some earthquake damage. So the head of the National Park Service is on the board as an ex officio of the Kennedy Center, and I asked him at the meeting, well, what are you going to do to fix it? He says, I don't know, I have to deal with Congress, it'll take a while, who knows what's going to happen. So I said, tell you what, I'll put up the money, fix it, forget Congress. And so he said, well, I don't know what it's going to cost. And
What you don't know that his very modest price for this is his face could be on the $10 bill. Right. But if
they have to be deceased for that. I don't want that to happen. Eventually they called me back and told me how much it cost. I said, fine. But then he called me a couple days later and said, I got a problem. What is it? well, Congress doesn't feel that they get credit for doing anything good. Could they put up half the money? Would they be okay with you? So I said, okay, fine. So we did it. And so we put up the money. And then I decided maybe there were some other things that needed repair or help. And so I visited Monticello, and I thought they could use some support. And then Montpelier, where James Madison's home. And then the Custis Lee Mansion, which is the crown of Arlington Cemetery. And then Iwo Jima Memorial. My father was a Marine, and as an honor of him, I did something there. And then recently the Lincoln Memorial, which needs some repair, and we're going to build an underground education facility there. So I've tried to look for historic sites where I have some interest connection, feel that the government isn't going to do what it should do, and I could make a difference. So I kind of marry these things up, call it patriotic philanthropy, but I don't have enough money to do it all myself, so I'm trying to encourage other people to do it, and I'll be holding a kind of a seminar soon for people who've signed the Giving Pledge to kind of say, well, maybe you would be interested in some of these causes as well. So I do those things, and I find it interesting, and I kind of feel that maybe I'm repaying my obligation to the country. So that's kind of some of the things that I've been focused on.
By the way, for those of you who have not been to the David Rubenstein Gallery at the Archives, it's one of the great new exhibits in Washington. If you have a chance while you're here, I recommend it highly. I will tell you, this has actually literally happened. I know two people who were sitting in the National Cathedral the other day during a funeral service, and the cathedral has had a lot of earthquake damage.
Believe me, they called me.
I know one of these people said to the other, too bad David Rubenstein isn't an Episcopalian, because he would...
Well, they did call me.
He fixed the cathedral.
They did call me, and I said, you know, my last name is Rubenstein. Aren't there any people who have a different last name? I mean, I just, you know, I might be kicked out of my religion if I did that. So but I think they found some other people.
One of the questions that, you know, we're talking to a group of highly accomplished professionals. You mentioned that a lot of people who at your level of philanthropy hire a lot of advisors, and they do good work, and consultants who do this, but it sounds like you do a lot of this yourself.
Yes, a lot of people have foundations. I don't have a foundation. I haven't figured out the reason why I need one, because I'm just giving away cash. I don't have appreciated stock I'm giving away. I just have cash, and I thought if I have a foundation, I'll have to organize it, and I'll have staff people, and the staff people will tell me what they want to do, and I'll have to argue with them, and so I just decide it's easier to do it this way. Now, the downside is that I don't have anybody to say no. And, you know, so I get a lot of entreaties from people, and already had a couple since I've been here. You know, so I try when I get letters and meet people to try to be polite and write what I think is a thorough letter explaining why this particular thing might not be for me. And, you know, but I don't have anybody that says no. I try to do it myself. I'm not saying that's the best thing, that our people have good foundation staffs. Bill and Melinda Gates have 1,700 people, I think, in their foundation staff, and it's very big. So I do it myself, and I enjoy it. I probably don't like saying no. Nobody likes to say no. And to be honest, most of the things that I do, like most people, most philanthropists do, are things that are my ideas. In other words, it turns out that most people in life generally like their own ideas better than somebody else's ideas, and probably you all agree with that. So if I have an idea, like buying the Magna Carta, I don't want to go to my staff and try to convince them. I just want to do it myself. So one of the pleasures of having no staff is I can decide to do it myself, and I do. Maybe at some point I'll have a staff and so forth, but right now I kind of do it myself, and I say 95% of the ideas that come to me I probably don't do. They kind of come to my own ideas, I kind of pursue them, and clearly, you know, one of the dangers of this is that if you get a reputation for doing things yourself, and if you have a reputation for visiting places, and let's say in historic sites, I'm nervous about visiting them if people know who I am, because they'll think I'm going to give, you know.
So you can go in disguise. You must
it's kind of, I don't know what to do, but I recognize, as all of you know this, if you're trying to raise money, and I do it all the time, I'm chairing 6 capital campaigns, and I'm asking for money for lots of things. You don't usually say to people, would you give me $25 million up front in the first letter? You don't do that. You say, we'd like your advice. Anybody ever thought about that idea, asking people for their advice? And I realize now that people really don't want my advice that much. They say, well, why don't you just come and we'll give you a tour, just a tour of something, and no commitment. But I realize that if you're in my position, if you do a tour, If you don't do something, they're very disappointed. They're going to say, why did they do this wrong? How did they do the tour wrong? Somebody's going to be fired because they gave a bad tour. So I try to be very judicious and try not to disappoint people and be impolite. There's no perfect way of doing this. The Giving Pledge, and it's a very interesting thing. The Giving Pledge was put together by Bill and Melinda Gates with Warren Buffett. The idea was this. In the United States right now, we give away roughly 2% of GDP, which is the highest in any country in the world. The United States has a tradition of philanthropy which exceeds every other country, and the reason is, to some extent, because of our roots. In Europe, the schools and the libraries and other kind of things like that were funded by government. So there was no tradition in Europe of giving away money, and therefore most European families would hand the money down to the next generation. In our country, when it first started, we didn't have any money. So there weren't government institutions that could fund libraries or fire departments or hospitals or universities. So you had to get people to give you money. And de Tocqueville, when he came here in the 1830s, pointed out that everybody in the United States seems to be joining a volunteer association. Everybody was volunteering for things because people were trying to make things happen. And the truth is, we still have this tradition. We pull together, we help create great organizations, universities and so forth, a large part by philanthropic gifts. We now give away 2% of GDP. Nobody else in the world is even close to that. But that's still not as high as some people thought we should have. And in fact, philanthropy had gone down a bit. Philanthropy, I like to point out, is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And I tell people, if you want to be involved in helping other people, you don't have to be rich. Give your ideas, your time, your energy. You can do things like that, and it can be still philanthropic. But if you're thinking about just money in terms of giving away money, we can do a better job, some people thought, in the United States. And for a while, in the 1970s and 80s, we weren't giving away, 1990s, that much money, relatively speaking. It was going down. Ted Turner made a famous call to rich people saying, all you rich billionaires, give away more money. You're not giving away money, you're just hoarding it. And that kind of became a clarion call that woke up people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others and said, yes, we should do more. Bill Gates retired relatively young from his company. He began this enormous foundation, the biggest foundation in the world for this kind of thing. And he and Warren and Melinda began the Giving Pledge. The idea was you get people who have a certain net worth, and they're going to commit to give away 50% of their net worth. And that's a fairly large amount of money for some people. Initially, we had 40 people sign the first time. Now we have about 160 people. But about 90%, 95% are from the United States because the tradition is much greater here. When Warren and Bill went to people in other countries and said, would you like to give away 50% of your net worth, they kind of looked like you're crazy. And some countries said, well, maybe we'll give away 5% because the tradition doesn't exist there. But now we've begun more and more to get people to realize that it's probably a good thing to give it away. And you can give it away under the Giving Pledge when you die or during your lifetime. But if you can still be a member of the Giving Pledge if you say you're going to give away 50% upon your death, and then when you die, you don't give it away. We can't disinter you, so we have no way to punish you. But the theory is that you should give it away. But interestingly, when I went to the first Giving Pledge meeting, I thought, okay, these are the rock stars of making money. These are the most greatest philanthropists, but also people who made enormous sums of money. And I expected it to be like a business council meeting, a business roundtable, where you have all these alpha males who are strutting around and they're dressed for success and so forth. And then I went there and I realized most of the people who have this kind of money are old. And and there were a lot of walkers, and there were a lot of oxygen tanks. And I was saying, this doesn't look like the image I had of all these extremely successful people. But, for a lot of reasons, these people had one good idea, so they made a lot of money. They didn't know quite what to do with it now, and they were in the process of giving it away. And they're very, very committed to it, and they are incredible philanthropists. And the biggest change that's really happened in philanthropy, aside from the Giving Pledge and other kinds of things, is that many people who have a lot of money now particularly have it at a relatively younger age, and they're trying to be more involved in the philanthropy. In the old days, John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie would write checks, and they would oversee perhaps what was being done, but they didn't really get engaged. They didn't do what Bill Gates is doing. They're running off to Africa and inspecting villages. And today, a lot of the tech billionaires are trying to reinvent philanthropy by getting involved and being as engaged with technology and novel thoughts about how to do philanthropy in ways that people hadn't done before. So we're reinventing philanthropy, or they really are, and trying to be much more engaged as opposed to just sitting back, writing checks, and having a foundation do it all for you.
One of the things you've mentioned, David, is that you're on both sides of this process, because not only do you give a great deal of money away, but you ask other people for a lot of money, having chaired these 6 capital campaigns. And what have you learned from that point of view? What have been your most successful lessons from being head of all these capital campaigns?
Well, it helps to give a large amount yourself.
Yeah, okay.
So if you're going to ask people for something and you're a chair of the capital campaign, you've obviously got to make a large commitment yourself. And generally, in most of the ones that I've been involved with, I've made the largest commitment, I think with few exceptions. And secondly, when you're asking people for money, you can't expect them to say yes immediately. Sometimes that will happen, and I've heard of an instance where somebody, David Skorton, when he was the head of Cornell, managed to get Chuck Feeney, who was a Cornell graduate, to give $350 million for New York Tech, basically by one meeting. He just met with him and said, "I need $350," and he said, "Okay." He said, "What do you say?" I said, "Okay." So, generally people take some time because they want to think it through. But generally, I think what the most effective thing is peer-to-peer asking. It's not usually the kind of thing where, honestly, a development officer is going to get a $100 million commitment. It's really got to be the head of the capital campaign or the head of the organization. The president of a university has got to do the asking. The head of the hospital, the head of the nonprofit organization probably has to do the asking. The chairman of the capital campaign can help, but I think the head of the organization has to make the asking. But it takes a long time to set it up, and I would say sometimes the process might take 2 or 3 years. A lot of university capital campaigns go on for 5 years or so. I'm the co-chair of the Duke Capital Campaign, the co-chair of the Harvard Capital Campaign, and these campaigns go on for 5 years or so. And sometimes people in the beginning of the campaign say, "Go away, I'm not interested," and towards the end they say, "Well, maybe I'll give you, a large sum," and it takes a while. So peer-to-peer asking is important. Follow-through is important. Listening is important. Listening to what the person says. If somebody says, "I have no interest in that at all, I'm interested in something else," don't keep pushing the thing the person's not interested in. So you've got to be, sensitive to what the person's interests are. There's no doubt that recognition is important. There was an ancient Jewish philosopher who said that the most important philanthropy and the best is anonymously. But, a lot of people don't like to be that anonymous. Chuck Feeney, who I just referred to earlier, he gave away $8 or $9 billion through the Atlantic Philanthropies, and many people didn't know where the money would come from. It was fairly anonymous. That's rare. Generally, people like some recognition. They either want their name on something or they like somebody to say something nice about them, and I don't think that's a terrible thing. So I think you should figure out what are a way to recognize the person. I think making certain the person will be engaged in the future as well, because as Benjamin Franklin said when he was raising money for some of his capital campaigns early on, to give early is to give twice. What does that mean? Well, it means that your best donors are people who already gave you money. So if you go back to somebody for a second and third time, as people often do, you're probably going to get a good answer because you've got somebody who's ready to give him money. But if you get money from them in the beginning and then you ignore them for 2 years and you come back later, probably not a good idea. So probably it's a good idea to keep them engaged and make sure that they are attended to by lots of events. And people like to go to events. People like to see how their money is being used. People like to have thank yous. I sometimes. I don't need it, but if I give scholarship monies out, sometimes they people whom are organizing scholarship efforts, they get each of the kids to write you a letter, and it's hard to respond to them all, but having somebody say thank you in an appropriate way is probably a good thing to do as well. So there no one secret, but
you mentioned Atlantic Philanthropies. This is called the
Atlantic Philanthropies.
And our mutual friend Joel Fleischman, who's been advisor, professor of philanthropy at Duke, and a close friend of David's and mine, and who is a brilliant thinker in the world of philanthropy. One of the things I always admired Joel for, what he understood was, you weren't just asking people for money, particularly when you're talking about universities and whatever. He wanted to know how they wanted the money used. He wanted their input as thinkers and as idea people, as well as just not just treating them as ATM machines. I thought it was a great
important point. Now, universities have needs. Universities didn't have capital campaigns. Harvard's first capital campaign was in 1640. University was started in 1636. In 1640, 3 people were sent to England to raise some money for Harvard. One of them decided never to go back to the United States. One of them was tried and convicted of a crime and hung, and the other actually got 500 pounds by saying that the money would be used to Christianize heathen Indians, that Harvard College would do that. But ever since that time, the capital campaigns have gone on, and now I actually say capital campaigns are probably permanent. You finish a capital campaign in 3, 4, 5 years or so, and then you have a pause, but then you go again. And so they're kind of permanent because the needs are great. I think they probably will continue to be significant for a while. But in university campaigns, the capital campaign has 3 virtues, to be very serious. One is when you're doing a capital campaign, you get all the constituent parts of the organization to come together to figure out what you're going to need the money for. You can't go out to say to somebody, Harvard needs $6 billion, give us the money. You've got to figure out what you're really going to do with it. So in the case of Harvard or Duke or other places, you spend a year or more trying to figure out what you're going to do with the money, and so you have a sensible explanation to potential donors of what you need with it. And it helps to bond the organization together and make the organization feel more cohesive when they've agreed on what their goals are. A second thing a capital campaign does is it does tend to increase endowment. Now, some capital campaigns will only get 20 to 30% of the money that comes in as endowment. The rest will be for operational use, but you will increase your endowment. And third, and most importantly, you will increase your annual giving. Because if you start at a certain level of annual giving, let's say Harvard was probably when they started their capital campaign, maybe they were $600 million. Now maybe their annual giving is around $1 billion, because what you do is you get more donors associated with the organization, and they tend to make annual gifts once they've made a capital gift. And so you tend to increase your annual giving. So it has a lot of those advantages. But when you're doing this, you can't just say to people, the president of the university, the chairman of the university, the head of the capital campaign think we need to build building X, and ignore what the donor wants. The donors may not want to build building X. They may think it's not important. So if you can't find anybody for building X, you have to listen to what some of the donors say. And sometimes donors actually have reasonable ideas. It might be better than the president of the university's idea. Somebody might say, well, I think this is a good program. I would fund it. Now, you can't, in a university setting or other organization setting, do something that's antithetical to the main goals of the institution. You can't say, I'll take the money even though it's something we really don't want and we hate the idea, but we just got to get the money in. That's not a good idea. But sometimes donors actually have reasonable ideas.
And we've seen in the last few years a couple of very prominent examples of money actually having to be given back because of the irreconcilable conflict with the institution.
That's true. Money was given back at Yale and some other places. So you've got to make sure you can use the money. But I think, there shouldn't be a presumption that because somebody is rich, they're stupid. They actually, donors sometimes have good ideas. And so maybe if a donor comes along and he says, I'd like to do this, you shouldn't assume that he or she doesn't have a good idea, and maybe be somewhat flexible that you can't destroy the institution by taking a certain amount of money. So you should listen. And I think listening to what the donor wants is probably a pretty good thing to do.
Now, let me ask you about this. You look at this room, I'd say a clear majority of the people in this room are women, not only as fundraisers, but as donors. And one of the most interesting trends in modern philanthropy is the rising role of women as philanthropists. In your experience, talk about whether you've noticed any discernible differences. Do women have a different agenda? Do they want to be approached differently? I know one of the cliches is men always want names on their buildings and women don't want the credit. But give me your take on this trend in the business.
Well, remember, when you're dealing with women or men, you have to recognize what's the source of the money, because that will probably be a bigger determinant than their gender. So did they make the money? Did they marry the money? Did they inherit the money? Do they feel guilty about having earned the money? A whole variety of different things. And what are their ages? Because obviously women or men look at things differently when they're in their 20s or their 30s or 40s or 50s or so forth. When you have an 85-year-old woman or man, they're going to look at things much differently than at somebody who's 25 or 30. I recently, at a Giving Pledge meeting, I interviewed Priscilla Chan, who is the wife of Mark Zuckerberg. And I asked her, look, you've got $45 billion to give away. I mean, and you're 31 years old. I mean, how do you decide your priorities, and what are you going to do? Why, you're a pediatrician, and she's a very good pediatrician, but why are you a pediatrician? Why don't you just let somebody else be a pediatrician and you give away the $45 billion? But she wants to be a pediatrician. There's nothing wrong with that. But in other words, it depends less on gender, I think, than then you know, the age in which they are, how they got the money, and so forth. And also, you have to deal with the fact whether the woman is single, that suppose she made the money herself, fine, or she married it, and then the husband is deceased. That person might look at it differently than a man who might have a woman who spouse who's deceased. And so it depends on a lot of other factors, just than gender. I would comment, though, on one thing I wanted to say, and it's the issue about fundraising. You know, if you go to Harvard Business School, well, I'll put it this way. How many people here have, in the last month, asked somebody for money for a business investment? Anybody? How many for a nonprofit? How many for a political thing? How many people have been asked for a business investment in the last month? Anybody been asked for a nonprofit? Anybody been asked for a political contribution? So generally, my experience is that fundraising is an important part of life as has evolved in the United States. But if you go to Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, any other good business school, or any public policy school, and look for a course in fundraising, it doesn't exist, because it's considered a lower species of kind of thing to do fundraising. And I keep telling business school deans, why don't you have a course in fundraising? And I spoke to you know, some academic deans the other day, earlier this week, and I was saying, look, a PhD is something that we granted people it began in 1150, the first PhD, in, I guess, in Paris. And you had to have 2 language skills, you had to have a paper, you defend a paper, a thesis, and so forth. But what they should have as part of a requirement is not just 2 language skills, but the ability to raise money. They should teach every PhD how to raise money, because everybody who's a PhD teaches is really spending a third of their time raising money, because all academics today have to kind of raise their own money. And it's a skill set that we don't teach people how to raise money, and we should not kind of think that it's something like you learn in the streets or something, or you learn, you know, on the side. Why not make it a serious academic discipline and say to people, there's nothing wrong with being a fundraiser. There's nothing wrong with asking people for money. So, you know, there's intellectual content to it, and so many people in our society spend a large amount of their time either being asked for money for a political, business, or philanthropic matter, or asking other people. And so I tell people to develop their fundraising skills no matter what your job is, because you're going to wind up asking people for money. And there's nothing wrong with it, but provided you're doing it in a good cause and you really believe in it. Now, it doesn't help if you're asking people for money saying, look, I don't think this is a good cause, I wouldn't do it, but you know, I got to ask you, that's my job. That's not going to work.
You know, one word you've used many times this morning, which I think is very important for a journalist, very important for a professor, 2 of the things I do, but very important for a money raiser is the word listen. Listen. Yes. You know,
yes, I was listening.
Listen. I'll say it louder. Listen. Right. Because you have an agenda as a fundraiser. You have needs. You have clients. But I think one of the messages I'm hearing from you is respect for the people that you are soliciting, respect for their ideas, respect for their preferences, respect for their inclinations, and not just imposing your views on the conversation.
Yes, and this is important. And I didn't come to the nonprofit fundraising world as a virgin exactly, because in building my business, when I began building it, I had people in my firm who had MBAs and finance skills. I'm trained as a lawyer, so I didn't really have the finance skills that one might think you should have at a private equity firm. So in any organization, I tell people, and I believe it to be true, that you should figure out what you can do to make that organization better, and what skill set you can do to make yourself indispensable to the organization. So as I built my firm, I realized my partners had really good skills in investing. They didn't want to go out and raise the money. So although I was a lawyer by training and I had young kids at home, I said, okay, I'll go ahead and run around the world and raise the money. So I did spend, 25 years begging for money, more or less, for the investment side, but that's easy, relatively speaking. If you take the 3 different types of fundraising that you can do, more or less, political to me is the easiest for this reason. One, the amount of money is relatively modest. You can ask people for $1,000 or $500, whatever it might be. The sums aren't that gigantic, and so I don't think that's that difficult. And today you can give larger sums, but even the larger sums you can give are still dwarfed by what you can give or ask for people in a business setting. When I'm asking for money for people in a business setting, I'm listening to them, what they want, so forth, but I'm saying to them, you give me money and I'm going to give you back more money. That's the theory of business investing. You know, it's not you give me money and I give you less back, it's I give you more back. And so that's not that hard, you know, if you have a reasonable product. The hardest is nonprofit, because what you're giving to people is a sense that they're going to be feeling better about themselves. They will help the world be a better place, but you can't measure it. You know, in business, you can measure profit and loss and return on investment. In philanthropy, you can't measure what you're giving to people. You know, you can put their name on a door, you can put their name on a building, and maybe that's a measurement, but there's no real metric that everybody agrees on in nonprofit. So it's hard to do, and it takes a long time to do it. And to do it, I think it is important to listen to the people. You know, I often tell people that, you know, if you give away money, in addition to living longer, the reason you'll live longer is not because God favors you so much, but people who give away money, in my experience, are happy. Grumpy people don't give away money. And generally, if you observe over life, grumpy people don't live as long. Maybe they don't want to live as long because they're grumpy, they're not happy with life. But if you give away money, people actually feel good about giving away money. Now, getting them to write the check might not be that easy, but after they've written the check and they see the product of their money, they're generally happier. And happier people generally live longer than grumpy people. That's my theory.
That's a good note on which to end. I think we have your slogan for next year's convention, which is "Give more, live longer."
Right.
I think
agree.
Really. David Rubenstein, what a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Steve. Thank you. Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.